So yeah, hi everybody. Great that you are joining. Welcome to our How to Build a Scalable Architecture, Software Architecture webinar with Seong. Did I say it correctly? Cool. Yeah, maybe just before we jump right into the session, just the context. How to build a scalable architecture. I think most of the lab's members worldwide are software startups, so to say, building software based on or with a focus on different technologies, can be blockchain, can be AI, and so on. But in any case, all of us, or all of you, basically want to scale it at some point, or should want to scale it, and hopefully will. That should be everybody's goal. So we wanted to do a little session today and see, okay, what to look at, what's important, what should I look at in the beginning, what becomes important later, and so on, like all the questions around it. So we will start with an introduction. So Seong will talk about himself a little bit, share some of his beliefs, and then we really want to go into a discussion. Received some questions up front, and you can also put some questions here in the chat if you want, or you can Slack me if you have my Slack. I'm David, by the way, from the WeWork Labs in Frankfurt. If we have somebody who dialed in from abroad who doesn't know our lab here in Frankfurt. So yeah, I think that's mainly it. So I think it's going to be a very exciting session. And I think, so maybe you can start with introducing yourself, Ampolon Ventures, and what you did so far.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Yeah, I think that's the most boring part, so I'll just keep it short. So, Seong, I started out as a software developer, but then moved into engineering management, had 3 startups of my own in the past. Very early stage startups, later some grown-ups, just Lendico, Delivery Hero, these types of, yeah, and then I'm now blessed to work at Ampolon Ventures. We are a venture builder. I'm blessed to be working with great founders every day. Yeah. We try to just go through the pre-seed phase pretty much of an early stage startup, find out, like, do the customer discovery, insight discoveries, try to have a general idea, like, hey, can we create something out of that, and what are the implications of what we do, and then ideally we fund it and hope for the best.
But mainly in the real estate world,
sort of focus is real estate, but we have very broad understanding of real estate. In the end, touches everything which concerns life, right? So which means we're looking into topics also of living situations of the elderly. How will our the society change? What implications does that have? So it's very interesting.
Cool. Yeah. And I mean, with Lendico and Delivery Hero, you have also very different kind of other backgrounds. Exactly. And your own startups. So very exciting. And how did you started? How did you start? So as a developer, as a business student, or?
No, really as a self-taught developer. I was just like hacking around, trying random stuff until it worked. Found that exciting. Yeah, just continued down the path there. Suddenly I found that, oh, that's valuable for some people. Yeah. Yeah, I was lucky.
Do you have some very cool learnings or stories to share from your way already that you want to share?
Some stories. I think a lot of it's a long learning process. And I think that's why we also see a lot of tech entrepreneurs having also a lot of technical background. There's this thing about the learning mindset, and software engineering is inherently hard. It's very frustrating sometimes, and you bang your head against the wall and spend nights. But this type of grit is actually very compatible with an early stage startup. Like, hey, I don't know, I find out how to do that, and that's actually, I think, the essence of any early stage founder. And yeah, as you mentioned, context. I think it's interesting to also set the context for why, because I try to ideally ask all of the audience's questions, but with probably not be able to do it. So I think it's a balance between being very specific, being somewhat general, that it doesn't help anyone. Or we end up with truism. It's usually what we end up when we're being too general, right? So, and similar with software engineering, if you're being too generic or you're being too general, or you're on a very high abstraction level, then you're not solving any problem at all, right? So, and this is, I think, the balance I hope we can strike today. But for the context, I think it's mostly early stage startups, because this is where I have the most experience with, and it will be mostly web applications, because just the nature of web applications being able to grow quickly, to have pretty much zero marginal costs if you add something, if you add new users, being able to roll it out with a pretty much infinitely. These type of things is just very inherent in web.
I think that's a good point. So what does scalability mean in the end,
exactly,
right? And when to start with it. So do you have for you like a definition is maybe too specific, but you know, your own explanation of what the scalability of software of an architecture means for you over time, so to say, or especially for an early stage startup?
I think for an early stage startup, I would say scalability is your organization. So one of our main hypotheses with our early investments is that the team matters the most. That's pretty much the only factor we have a modicum of influence over, where we just see like, how are these people, what makes them tick, and you start out with that, right? So you have a great idea, you have a plan, and you have a team. And that organization is your infrastructure. You're building upon that. That's your platform you're working with. Which means, like, sorry for the clickbait title, because everyone probably expected something different. But in the end, it's like what makes it scale is pretty much how a team approaches the problem. And I think especially for early stage startup. We have this notion of product market fit, and I think that encapsulates it quite well, right? So in the end, the question of like, what are we scaling for, right? So, and there's two sides, the product and the market, right? And that's also the mostly tech product side and the business side of the whole thing, right? And trying to find a match there.
I think it's really interesting. So if I understand you right, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the scalability itself for you has a couple of angles. So one is not just the software architecture itself, but also your organizational approach, your team, and how you actually approach development.
Exactly.
And then you have the business side, so to say, the market, and that scalability is always tied to the market you're in and the market dynamics you're in. So it does not mean like just, I don't know, balancing servers or so, or adding another node or something like that.
But it's an aspect of it, but I think it's not at the core of it. Like we have these types of feedback loops, right? So code, compile, fix, probably. And the other feedback loop we are in with early stage startups is really like form, frame, and hypothesis, test it, develop an experiment, test it, test it against the market, come back, right? And have to cycle it. You need especially the business point of view to get that feedback, right? So otherwise you don't have to do that.
I think that's a cool takeaway for myself, to be honest, as well, because I was mainly looking in my recent years as a founder, a non-technical founder though. I was mainly looking at the technical part, to be honest. And I was always trying to understand how can we make sure that if we at the next big corporate client with probably 10,000 users, how to make sure that the software is stable and that we have 99.9% of reachability, so to say. But adding the other angles, like let's say one is culture, one is business, and one is management in the end, maybe a little bit, although it interferes with culture. But all of those have to be set up right to like have a scalable product in the end.
Exactly. And in the end, there was the saying that the product, so any organization becomes the product at a certain scale, right? And
Yeah.
that's, I think, this is pretty much at the core of it, the ability to deliver on your promise in the end, right? So, and that goes with the whole organization, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with what do you usually start with? What of those angles? Do you start with setting up the team structures, how you want to work together, like with what kind of methods, or with the Kanban or with Scrum or whatever, or with the first line of code? Is there, like, for you like the initial start of the product, so to say?
Yeah, in the end, when we have such small teams in the beginning, we hope that these teams, every member of the team is an individual contributor and a leader, right? So in the end, we just hope for the whole team to figure out what is right. And I think the core question everyone asks, or should ask, is like, what value do we bring to the customer, right? And then there's two components, right? So what is that value, right? So what drives that value? And then who's the customer? Like why, and the customer also has a business view on them, right? So in the end, there's this idea of jobs to be done and similar things where in the end, the idea is the customer is employing your product to solve something for them, right? And which means the customer is also an investment hypothesis, right? So the customer will say, like, I'm going to invest in it, right? It can be huge because you have large upfront costs, you need to change your own organization, these types of costs, right? And then the returns on that. And this is to be aware of what drives that customer and how the customer sees it is very important. And I think, especially in early stage, anyone in that organization should understand that. And that goes for the developers. And that's, I think, where we usually start with, try to have the clearest picture, the context of, like, what are we trying to solve actually.
In my old startup, I was at some point believing that the product manager should tell the CTO what to do, and the CTO only says how to do it. Because I think, to be honest, we were somehow lacking that mutual understanding of also the business angle, and maybe the cultural angle wasn't the problem, but the business angle in the architecture, so to say, or in the product and the development of the product.
But I think these domains you're speaking of are also, like, they are also mental models, I think, right? So they have a perspective on the same thing, and then they build their own models, and that's pretty much how we think as people, right? So where we just try to have either analogies or similar things, but we try to build a model and then try to refine it over time. And having different models available also expands your tool set. And I think that's like the core of the culture, where we try to create learning cultures, where we try to learn from each other, see, like, hey, can I add that to my tool set, right? So one question revolved a little bit around technical depth. We can go into that later, but this was one thing where actually the business view gave me a really great model to understand technical depth, for example. And that's something where once you start combining that, then you can learn many new things. And that's actually the core of an early stage startup, to learn. Right?
One thing, I mean, you just mentioned, like, when you're very early, you have small teams usually, and in most of the cases, relatively limited resources, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So I often get the question from especially non-technical founders who do not have a CTO yet, for example, but also from teams who have technical founders or developers in the team, but where the question is make or buy, so to say. Where it might be the question in the beginning, should we outsource our product, so to say, for at least the MVP production or development to maybe to an offshore kind of agency? And connected to that, my question would be looking at scalability. What impact does it have, and do you have any thoughts about it? Is that okay? Are there any factors that you really have to look at?
Yeah, I think it won't help the audience to just start any answer with "it depends," right? But this will probably be the first answer. But I think for especially early stage startups, founders, we had also a specific question. And that the interesting thing is, And there's also this tool set which comes more from the business point of view, like asking what are the incentives for your provider, right? So you're employing someone else to do something for you, and then the question is like, okay, how is that person or this organization incentivized? And when you look at outsourcing, it's usually delivered to specs, on time, on budget, right? So they want to increase their throughput, obviously, right? So, and that has implications, right? So first, the specs, right? So then most of it will revolve around the specs. So you cannot employ someone else to figure out the specs for you, because you should be the expert of understanding what the product is for, right? Or who that is. So my suggestion would be, if you want to run specific experiments, right? So you just have an hypothesis, you can create a small set of some type of thing which can give you a clear yes or no answer, ideally. Then that is a great way. But when you see your organization as a learning organization, then the value lies in where you go while you're developing, right? So a lot of things in software is emergent, right? And then if you want that to stay in the organization, then I would rather suggest to build it with your own team, because then whatever you learn stays also with the organization. You cannot just ask then the supplier to like, hey, what architecture change? They don't usually track that.
And it can be an asset. It doesn't have to be. It depends on what technology probably, or how deep tech it is.
Yeah.
If it's your very own, very specific machine learning algorithm, you should probably have developed it yourself.
Exactly.
If it's a marketplace standard feature, probably it's more okay from a business perspective or asset perspective.
Exactly. I think in the later stages it becomes more interesting when you are clearer about specific things, right? So, or if you want to test on large scale, let's say you want to, I don't know, you have a social network and then you have like people you may know feature, right? And you can clearly describe what that's supposed to achieve, and then you already know the specs, and you want to run it in experiment to just see, are people catching up on that or not, right? So these types of things maybe, right? But you have a very clear picture of what it is. I think also the question was also in the context of architecture. I think a lot of early stage startups don't know exactly where it's going, right? So that's this constant thing, and that's also the biggest hit on velocity in the end early, that everyone says like, hey, it feels like the requirements are changing constantly, but that means like you just have more information, right? So, and that's in the nature of things. So just a blanket statement, just don't try to abstract too early, too much. Right? So,
it feels for me like even it's impossible to come with, if you want to outsource something, to come with the idea of, I have a fixed budget because my resources are limited. I have 25,000 euros. While I am, in fact, in an agile environment, also with learning about my clients, as you said, or customers, as you said, it's not specifically the requirements changing, but the information about the customer, and that has an impact on the requirements.
Exactly.
And asking on one side for a fixed price, and on the other side, you have iterations over iterations.
Exactly.
This cannot really work, and if somebody agrees to it, I would even be very careful in working with them. Especially if somebody says, hey, that's okay, we gotta do it. I've been there, and it was a big mistake.
Same here. That's how we learn. We make our mistakes. I think, and that's a very good point actually you're bringing up, because like we went through that iteration, right? So that's the worst thing you can do to a supplier, to say like, we learned something new. Can you adapt to that? Right? While this is at the core of your business, actually.
And those change requests in the end, they make it more complex and more expensive than for you in the end.
And the supplier will just expect a fixed set of requirements.
And it might happen quickly that the supplier is even happy to bill more hours in the end, because that's their business model, right?
Exactly.
Or in many cases, not in all cases, there's specific other models, but okay, but getting more into the technical angle, so to say, of scalable architecture. I'm just thinking about how to put the question, but or maybe the other way around. Did you ever have the case in your career, so to say, where you had to, let's say, throw an existing architecture away and completely rebuild because you had so many either new requirements or before that time you did not have the resources to already invest in such a big architecture, so to say, if we really go on a technical level, let's say with a microservice infrastructure or so on?
Both actually, and it still remains to be seen, funnily enough, but because in the end you don't know what the other outcome would have been, right? So it was definitely, I would say now, it was a mistake sometimes to think too early about scaling the architecture or scaling, because in the end you still don't know, right? So what are you scaling for? Is it transactions? Is it traffic? But that's a very abstract metric, right? It's the same as to say like, hey, we are scaling our business for revenue. Yes, it's true, but it's not specific enough, right? So and these are emergent properties of you doing something either right or wrong, right?
So that means, first of all, you need to find out what you want to scale, and therefore you probably need some set of not only KPIs, but also analytics for that, right?
Exactly, for example, right? So these are the things like, do I understand actually what we are doing? And then also the same thing whenever it comes to performance in the tech context, then the first rule is measure, right? So don't guess, but measure where the biggest impact is. Usually the 80-20 rule applies as well, right? So, and you can fix the biggest hit on whatever performance you have with a small subset of changes.
Yeah, that's for me a second important learning also for today, so to say, for me personally, that scaling also means to find out what very specifically you're trying to scale, or what set of measures or goals, and then how you find that out, how much you need to be scalable for each of those goals, so to say. So and have a first step of implementing analytics to some extent.
Exactly, and this is also where the business toolbox helps, where you say like, hey, if I overscale, right? So then you wasted pretty much resources, right? In the end, and that's what you're also trying to optimize for. You're not over provisioning things or whatever, right? So this is also a view to have, like, do we exactly know what we want to achieve? And then you will always be surprised, but there's this truism that, hey, this is a luxury problem if you're growing so quickly that you cannot keep up, right? And that's there's some truth to it, because in the end, in the early stages, achieving growth is the hardest part, I think, right? And then we tend to think of growth as fixed new set of new situation and panic or whatever that might be, but it's still discrete, right? So you can still say, create smaller chunks of times where, let's say, you're doubling, right? So you start doubling every 6 months, and then you double every 3 months, but you still have these chunks of time, and they are kind of predictable, but they are discrete. So you can actually think about, okay, what do we need to do if that doubles, right? So, and then you have a margin of error, and you say like, okay, let's say it goes tenfold or whatever, and then this gives you information on what to actually do, an informed decision rather than also guessing. I expect this to hit whatever piece of my software.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I have been in the situation when being in the very, very early stages, say, before writing the first line of code, maybe, to think on a small scale, and think, so, hey, maybe I will have the first 100 users a day, and 90% of them are ourselves checking out the website, and the other 10% is family and friends. Up to in 5 years in our growth plan, we will have like a booking.com kind of website where millions of customers will try to check rates and images every second. And for me, it was really hard in that situation to think about, so what do I have to prepare right now for this big picture?
Yeah.
And or what is necessary already? What do I have to pre-think and implement already? But I think what you just said is that looking more in smaller steps, because because looking into 5 years in the future,
we know how well plans hold, right?
Exactly. Even like people who are, what is it called? Those futurists, so to say. So scientists who really try to predict future with crazy models. They say more than 5 years is basically impossible. And they're doing nothing else than that.
Yes.
So putting it down into smaller chunks and more finding first out what specifically will you need. And implementing the right measures and analytical tools is a first step, and then you can go with the requirements coming up over time.
Yeah, I'll let you in on the secret, and sorry for the tech audience that I'm spoiling the secret. It's like almost like a magician giving up the trick. But if the tech guy says, like, hey, think about the implications of scaling in X years, right? So we need to fix it now. That usually means that they feel uncomfortable with the state of what they have at the moment, and they are afraid they cannot keep up, right? So, and that's a normal curve. You will see that the velocity will go down, the more complex their system becomes, and that's normal. And that's also the segue, I think, to the technical debt question, where like the business view helped, right? So I think technical debt is an amazing analogy, because debt is something we are all familiar with, right? Some might have personal debt, maybe, but that's, I think, also the view, right? So for a technical person, technical debt is a personal liability, and it is they see it as, okay, that will inhibit my ability in the future to do whatever, right? And that's correct. So private debt is usually a very bad choice to make, right? So you're consuming something you cannot afford, right? So it's generally a bad thing, because you cannot say like, oh, I'm gonna increase my revenue by tenfold, for example. You don't have the liberty to do that in your private context, right? So and for a tech person that feels like that, but in a business context, every business should have some amount of debt, right? So that's a health metric actually for a business, right? So the debt equity ratio, these type of things. And the interesting point is, you say, hey, when we take on this amount of debt, we can grow so quickly that the debt and the interest we pay on that is offset by the gains we have, right? And this is a very rational decision. And I think also in terms of technical debt, we can apply that logic and say like, hey, if we achieve that type of growth, or we reach this, or we can deliver that to the customer, anything else might actually even out over time.
I really like the analogy, because in the end, the technology part of a company, or is in the end the, let's say, the enabler for the product.
Exactly.
And it's all part of the business model, the underlying business model.
Exactly.
And you cannot exclude or make an island, so to say, just of technology and create code just for the beauty of code and for aesthetics, so to say. But when you say you need customer centricity in your business model, then this customer centricity and this focus on the product for the customer and all the business relevant metrics I think it really makes sense to apply them also to the technology part.
Exactly, and that gives you a new perspective. I think it can be also freeing, right? So some things if you consciously decide to do something, then sure, you're also responsible for it, but it frees you to actually achieve other things or put your focus on the things which matter more.
Yeah. Before we get into the questions from you guys, maybe one last thing that I found really interesting. You were probably somehow involved with investors, right? So investors had certain ideas of how the business should scale, and thus also the technology. So do we have any learnings or experiences with applying the technical depth, so to say, in the investor world? So did they even see that that you tried to do that?
That's actually almost irrelevant, because it's on a different abstraction level in the end, right? So it's more like sausage. Like, if you don't want to know how it's made, it's like as long as it tastes good. Yeah. So in the end, what you want to do is, and I'm now also in the other side, and I'm looking also at it from an investor's perspective. I think it's about growth, right? Anytime some investor sees a hockey stick, they will come. Then you have their attention, right? Yeah. So, and what else is needed to just hold that up and make it still function, right? And that's okay. And for the investor, it's also clear that it's not perfect, right? So everyone knows it. In the end, and that's why everyone says, like, solve the real pains for the people, right? So if people are using your product despite of everything which goes wrong or doesn't work, right? So Zoom is now pretty good, so that's fine, but it took a while to get to this, right? So, but we still use it because it created so much more value for us, right? So, but video conferencing used to be a pain for a long time, for example, right? So, but we still went through it, and Skype worked at a time where it was like weird, but the phone bills were so expensive that it was just the gains you had. You would jump through all the hoops, actually thinking about, like, hey, getting your parents to install Skype or these type of things, right? So, but it was still worth it, right? So, and this, I think, is what drives that and makes evens out that specific pain you have as a tech person when it comes to this.
Yeah, I think it's another cool takeaway that probably investors won't look into the architecture. They want to see it in the context of the company's growing and can keep up with the business, so to say. But I know, again, from my startup Accommodeo, that sometimes we had the problem that we wanted to deliver a feature for a corporate client, let's say for Siemens, and then it took weeks over weeks, and then I figured out that some parts of the tech team actually installed or implemented a new version of Typeform or so, which was nice for the code itself and the beauty of the code and the ease of using it. But in that moment, it felt like, wait, but it's really important to have that feature for the client because it will drive revenue and will make their life easier. And they requested it, otherwise they're probably not going to use the tool at all. Yeah. So I think sometimes it's good to see also that from the investor side, the actual how is not so important, but it's important that it works. And I know from ourselves, but also from other founders, that at the other hand, you're proud of the technology that you created, and then you want to show it. And I remember we had an investor meeting, and one of the developers created a visual version some kind of tool which showcased how the microservices are working with each other and how many data requests were sent between all the microservices. And the investor didn't even look at it at all. They were like, the guy thought it's a screensaver. And said, so where's the slide with the numbers? So I think that's also important for founders to understand, hey, not always come just with the details of the technology, although you're super proud of what you created, but just, as you said, the aggregation level is another one that you need for the investor.
Exactly, and that's actually a good one to take. I think, like, if you have a good investor, that perspective can also help you with your decisions, right? So usually it's not that clear cut, right? So it's either A or B, but rather A or B maybe, right? And both seem equally valid and whatnot, right? So, but in the end, the question, like, hey, does it help the customer, right? So is it the thing, like, is it the most important thing that the customer will the customer leave? That generally is also debatable, right? So you can, but yeah.
Load balancer 3000, nobody else uses it. They won't care.
Yeah, exactly. As long as it delivers on the promise.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, really nice. Some very good insights already. So now, guys, let's look into your questions. You provided some. We have some which were provided before and some which were provided here in the chat. Let's start with the ones provided before. And by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to add them now. And we can at some point probably also do it. If you don't want to write it, you can do it directly over Zoom. But first, let's start with some of the ones which were uploaded. By the way, you can as deep or non-deep as you want, and we will see if you can answer it or not. So I think some of them we already answered pretty well, but I think here one is, hi Seong, do you have any experience with serverless architectures, FAAS, and would you recommend it for SaaS startup companies? And it has a second part, do you have experience with it, or do you know some successful use cases where serverless architectures were making an important impact? Should I repeat the first one?
No, I think that it's pretty
the
much
experience
the same
with
context.
SaaS, and do you recommend it for SaaS? It's by the way from Lucas.
Yeah, so we used serverless, especially in event-driven architectures where we would usually work on a lot of information coming in data streams and similar. And for this purpose it was built. I would just generally say, without knowing the specifics, if you use serverless, you are also tying into that ecosystem, right? So you want to also use the other parts, right? So if it's Amazon, then you would probably want to use Kinesis or these types of things, data streaming. But then you're buying into this platform pretty much, right? So then it makes sense. But then you also want to use that, right? So I think as a pure way to run your software, I would say it creates more problems than,
Okay, wow. It just comes up in my mind another a question regarding that, because we have some cases where startups are using, I mean, it's not directly connected to that question, but in the same world, so to say, using, for example, AWS, but are thinking about changing to Azure or so. But maybe from because it interests myself, because I get that question or the case often. How hard is it to change from one to the other, so to say, to migrate it? Like Google Cloud, and we have people working with Telecom Cloud and so on, because the Tech Boost program, for example, offers so many cool perks. But does it make sense, or how easy is it to migrate?
It really depends on how deeply involved you are. If you're really tied into the specific services, and they are really great services out there, right? And I would advise many to not just build their own, because these services are great, but then you're pretty much tied in. If you're just using it for server capacity, then it's a lot easier now if you're looking at what Kubernetes does to the whole cloud world. Then yes, it can be easier, but you need good reasons to do it in the end.
Okay, cool. Then let's see, what other questions do we have? So question one from Tim Behrens. What are 2 to 3 common pitfalls that you happen to see all the time and which we should and can easily avoid? Tim, maybe can you specify a little bit about in what area? Or do you already have an answer in your head?
I have a few things which just generally might apply to software engineering. I think so. We are always working on abstracting things, right? So we create models of something else, and then we reap the benefits in the emergent properties. So that's our daily routine pretty much. And I think everyone knows that abstractions are leaky, right? So the map is not the territory, it's the same, right? So just because you know the map doesn't mean that you can just walk through there. And so, the earlier we try to abstract things, the less resolution we have actually. And especially early, we need a lot of resolution actually, because there might be something in the details which is actually the amazing thing, the amazing insight, where you suddenly understand the customer better or know why they are using it. And so, and this is something maybe to focus on also early, like what have we found out that the others haven't found out, right? So even though it seems from the outside like, oh, it's just another one, there is a reason why specific things are better, right?
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, for the question. You have another one, which is, what is your take on graph databases as general database? Any recommendations?
General data. The problems with database along is like, it really depends.
You can be a lawyer.
Yes, tech guys are actually, there's a lot of overlap with law actually, because you have the set of defined criteria, right? And then you try to reason like what the result of that is, right? So, and then you're like, okay, you just try to mitigate risks, right? So in the end, it's very good to ask a tech person if you want a better question, right? Rather than the binary, like, will it work or will you be done in whatever? Like, what's the likelihood of being done, right? So that creates a better thought process also in the other side, right? So, and I think that's actually a good trick to do, right? So to, instead of just going for what you need to know, right? So because in the end, as a business, it's still hard to find out, like, have a chance of success maybe, right? So, or a risk level, or like, and then you can get a better information actually from tech people.
Good to know. Okay, but going back to the graph database, the general database.
We work with the graph databases. A general database, I think. It really depends on the use case, I think.
Okay, let's say the use case is, I mean, basically we're doing process automation and we're mapping the environment within the company. And so to say, try to depict it into the ontology and then, name the different entities that are interlinked. And generally speaking, a lot of companies are coming to us and asking us, what is the most future-proof architecture, so to say? And from a few experiences I've made with quite good companies is that they are heavily, relying on graph databases for such,
The graphs are generally amazing. In the end, like every software you write is a graph, right? So you can translate pretty much anything into a graph. And if it's really about traversing the graph, finding out like what then, and from what you just described, it sounds like a fitting solution, but it's really hard to say. To say, okay, it's make a general statement about it, right? So I think that's a very technical decision, and I think the danger is with these blanket statements that you end up with having a solution ready, right, and then trying to fit the problem to the solution, then that becomes dangerous. So that's why I'm a little hesitant, but from what you just described, that seems like a graph data. It seems like,
Cool, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions from your sides before I put out my weird questions? You can either write it down or say it directly into your Zoom if you like. Otherwise, think about it. You still have the chance. I will just go on with another not so technical question from my side, but coming back to your history, so to say, your career, let's put it like that. Coming from being the developer, writing the code,
yeah.
to where you have been then as a technical director, or are now, or have been as a CTO. How did your own role change? So how much code do you write today?
So I would love to write codes. I do it now for entertainment reasons, to relax actually, but I don't, it's not my go-to thing to deliver value anymore, and that's actually okay. I have come to terms with it. So to say, I think the main driver was to figure out that software, that's a nice thing, you can solve a lot of problems, and it is a very clear thing also, usually when you know what you're doing and how to get there. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is actually figuring out what to do, and that involves immediately people. If you're working in a team, if you're a solo developer, then it's a different story, but mostly in startups we will want to have teams, and then we will also want to grow the teams. And then this is where I saw the most friction actually, the different expectations, the different, all the things which go in between, right? So this is actually the complex domain of a business, right? And software is complicated, which means it is still a massive thing, but you can ideally predict, if you know every detail of the machinery, you can predict what it's going to do. That's complicated. Complexity you cannot predict, right? So and that's actually what happens when you have an organization working with each other, and getting that, understanding the dynamics of that, and making it work for a purpose. That was where I suddenly found the thing where I said, okay, this is how you scale. Like one person, pretty much, like make it more effective with other people, right? So, and that's actually, I think, what drove every decision in terms of the career.
So also your role changed in the way that you got more into translating between business and code, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, translating seems like they speak different languages. It's not it. It's even, I hope so, at least. So I hope the purpose is clear, right? So, but there are many different roles, right? So, it's more like a sports team, let's say football or whatever, right? And then you have attackers and defenders, and they have different roles, but being able to anticipate what the other is going to do is going to make you a better team. And then understanding their reasoning, right? So what is the decision-making process for a specific situation? And then these types of things, this is, I think, what makes a great team.
Cool. Yeah. Exciting. How, or did you have specific challenges with, let's say, non-technical C-level, so to say? You were surrounded by founders, co-founders, however, where in your specific role?
Yeah, this is actually the thing, right? So wanting these specific binary questions, right? So because yes, it's true. That's what we ultimately want to find out, right? So, but just because the outcome is what you care about doesn't mean you can answer what the outcome will be, right? So it is a very, then it becomes complex, right? So you cannot just say like, hey, will that be done in whatever, right? So it depends on a lot of factors, and not understanding the process to get there, that's, I think, what creates a lot of misunderstanding, actually, right? So, and I think also now having had roles in C-level, and also now, as from the investor's perspective, it's also a little bit of laziness to just ask people about the outcome, because that means you didn't do the mental work to understand like what factors is driving the outcome, right? So it is like a CEO only asking for the revenue, right? That's not a very good CEO, I would say, because that's the outcome of everything which goes into that, right? So, and having understanding of clear parameters which drive your revenue, that is actually what makes it interesting.
So the culture of mutual understanding is probably the basis for a scalable, not just software
Yeah,
or product, but for the whole company.
Exactly. Yeah. And the company is the product in the end, right? So you're buying Apple, you're buying. That's the thing. And yes, you might buy the Mac, but you're buying actually Apple.
And everything that's tied to it, from the experience of unpacking, unboxing to after sales when you have a problem. And that's all part of your organization in the end.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Oh, I see there's another question coming in from Shivali. The question is, what are the recommended back-end languages, frameworks for fintech startup at MVP stages versus growth stage? And what are the pros and cons? For example, .NET Core, Java, Node.js.
Oh. I had specific things where I was just more familiar with, right? So, and that's also natural tendency, right? So it is familiar, it's easier, you feel you can be quicker. I would just say it's not a big factor in the thing, right? So compared to, yes, there are details which will enable that, but again, just the power law distribution says there are things which have so much impact. These types of decisions around the specific tools, the specific languages, the specific frameworks don't impact the outcome that much, right? So when you're seeing it from an outcome perspective, and in the end, if you're an early stage startup, you want to survive, right? Yeah. So that's the outcome. And I have yet to see at least an example of where that was the decision factor, the language or whatnot, and what might have been that people were uncomfortable, but with whatever, and then the team couldn't understand, and then someone else would go off and do their own thing and build the same thing again, and these types of things. But that means there hasn't been enough understanding and communication of what was necessary, right? So and that can jeopardize it, but I think it's not inherent to the technology, but it is actually about the team.
Are there any then maybe frameworks or languages where you see that, especially for fintech, maybe let's say security or regulation kind of factors are better met than in other languages or so?
For fintech, I mean, it's a Java world you're in, right? So either you're on mainframe or you're Java. I think we've gotten a lot better now with interoperations. I think cloud services or consuming everything as services also creeps in everywhere, also in very slow-moving industries. So it doesn't matter that much anymore. I think if it's for familiarity, if you want some engineers with domain knowledge, then you will probably gravitate more towards Java. But I think these are not the deciding factors, at least for early stage.
Okay, very good to know.
I mean, for us, we had a mixture of Java and Go.
At Lendico.
Yeah. Was a great choice, but also dependent on the people actually doing it.
Yeah, of course. And probably also, who can you get in as talent, maybe, right?
That might actually be a bigger factor, right? So that's the thing. Right?
Interesting. Cool. Another question from Lucas. I read that more and more startups are open sourcing their code to leverage feedback and contributions from the open source communities and to use this as a marketing tool. What would be Seong's opinion about it?
I think open sourcing, yes, you mentioned it, it depends on what the strategy is, right? So it can be a great distribution strategy, right? It can be, but then the business model changes to you are providing consultancy around your software, you're providing specific things on top, it can be hard if it's a pure tech product. You see it a lot now with the cloud providers taking on open source software and actually having the bulk of the value creation for themselves, because they provide the whole experience in the end. I think for technical people, if adoption and access to software it's actually a distribution strategy in essence, right? So that can be very great. It can go viral quickly in that sense, right? So, but the whole outlet, what you will provide after that changes, and just open sourcing is also not happening, right? So you need to create a vibrant community around it, and that's actually where the bulk of the work will go into. So it is a different business, I would say.
Do you see any difficulties generally in the startup world with using open source, and how, for example, investors or also maybe corporate clients in the B2B world have a problem with it as an asset or something in that area?
Yeah, I think it changed a lot. So there used to be this notion of like, hey, what is your IP?
Yeah.
These types of things. I think it changed a lot, and I think the cloud services actually helped us to change that notion, right? So where the core of the value creation is actually making it available or accessible to large audience and providing then guarantees around it, right? So either reliability or security or these types of things, where that's a huge value driver, right? And then the technology is just the enabling layer of the thing. And I think more and more people catch up on that, right? So,
which also fits to your definition of scalability, that it's not just a pure technology and the code and the frameworks,
exactly.
but that it's how your organization works to be the product, so to say.
Exactly. And this is why, for example, IBM bought Red Hat, right? So because in the end, this is the value is in the organization and the learnings they have, the ties they have with the open source community,
the business logics, the processes, and so on.
Exactly. But also then the influence they have over the open source projects they govern, right? So and these types of things, and then it becomes strategic more.
Cool. So we're almost at the end. 1 minute left, but we have another question. So by the way, thanks for the questions, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Florentina, as we are a marketplace in the wedding industry and want to move from our browser MVP to an app, which languages systems would you recommend? As a non-tech founder, I struggle to make the best short or long-term decision.
This is, just making blank, again, like a general statement around like what is best is usually very hard. I think the parameters are like, who are your main customers? Where are they coming from? What are they using?
iOS or Android,
for example, that is already.
Who spends more? Who's the persona?
Yes, exactly. These, I think, way more important factors. And then if you're on iOS and you say like, what drives the experience? Does it have to be snappy? Whatever. These type of things then inform what comes out. I think. And I totally understand the question, right? So it's like in the end, when you run a business, we want to understand the risks and mitigate them either, or consciously disregard them because we say that's probably not going to happen, or these types of things. And this is also a risk mitigation strategy, but I would say there is no general risk mitigation. Otherwise, it will come with a cost, right? So there's no thing which just removes a risk for a fixed set of pricing.
And then probably other factors come in, like can you find talent, like people who can build it? If you build it with React Native and you can learn it yourself in 2 months, maybe that's a good thing to be able in the future to at least be on an eye level, so to say, with your tech team or so. But as you said, I think going first from the business side, being very specific about who is your target group. Like, for example, maybe not all brides in Germany or in Europe, but only those who are in, let's say, the big cities, or maybe not the big cities, because those who are in the big cities have a good supply anyways around them, but the others don't. And maybe those who have a certain income, then you can probably find out what, where you can, find them, what devices they use, what is important for them. Is it more the bling bling factor? Is it usability? What are your major drivers of the business? What do you want them to do in the app? Is it very complex? Is it super easy? Just a normal checkout process, for example. And then you can probably find out, where do I need, is it okay to work with a more simple kind of thing with limited options like React Native or so, or is it better to be very specific on iOS or on Android and create native apps?
Exactly.
Cool.
Thank
God you were saying okay right now.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. That's the thing, right? So, and that's finding out more about the parameters, because suddenly you can find also a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve, right? So, that is really at the essence of business, right? So around the organization.
Totally. Florentina just wrote she was thinking about Flutter and React Native, and she's sure that's for the beginning enough.
You can start with it, just
And I think it's really, if you see what is the core customer journey in the app. So what ideally happens when your perfect customer comes into the app? Is it a specific purchase? Is it a specific search they want to do? And if you know that very specific, like the perfect core customer process or journey, from hitting the app to doing a checkout or performing any kind of action that brings you the growth that you need. If you have isolated then that core journey, then you can see what features are actually necessary and are they met by Flutter and React Native or not.
Exactly. And for example, like if you have this type of app, then you might focus on sharing, right? So you want to quickly share with your friends, right? That might be the only, or share with your significant other to find out if that's the right thing, right? So
the bridesmaid, hey, how do you like it?
Exactly. Maybe, and then you might want to focus on the thing like, how does the sharing happen? Are there barriers in the specific solution you chose with the platform you're using, right? So these types of things, I think, then become more interesting as parameters.
And by the way, sorry for being very stereotyped and just saying brides. Can also be men who try to arrange the wedding. So I would say that's it from our side. Thank you guys for your questions and for attending, and of course, thank you, Seong.
Thank you so much
for all the insights. I think we have some very cool takeaways. So first one is, for example, that scalability does not just mean the technology part, but also the culture, the processes, the management, and so on, and the company as a whole, how it's organized. I think a second one that I took with me is that when it comes to technical scalability, work in chunks, but not try to pre-create a crazy architecture, which you might need only in 5 years, but don't know yet. And that investors often or usually do not look at the how is it made, but at the outcome. So I think that's for me where the major factors or the major takeaways. I think that's it from our side, guys. Thank you very much. We will also we have recorded that, by the way, and we'll put it online so you can watch it again if you've missed something. This will be, if you have already, to answer your question, Rebecca, in the on the Insider platform under Learning. You can also find it in the members.weworklabs.com in our new, say, WeWork Labs Facebook. On the left side, you have a learning button and it will guide you through it, but it might take a couple of days. So that's it. Thank you guys and have a great rest of the week. And thank you again, Ampolon Ventures, and you specifically, Seong. That was very cool. See you guys.
Thank you guys.
Bye-bye.